Arthur stood on the edge of the wind-swept pier, the cold North Sea air biting at his exposed face, staring down at the rusted hulk of the Cormorant. To anyone else at the maritime liquidation auction, the vessel was nothing more than floating debris, a 60-foot trawler that had seen its best days before most of the bidders were even born. The hull was streaked with decades of oxidation, the wheelhouse was peeling, and the rigging hung limp like the skeleton of a dead animal. But Arthur wasn't looking for a beauty queen. He was looking for raw materials. His own boat, the Sarah Jane, was currently dry-docked with a blown transmission, and the cost of a new one was more than he made in 2 seasons of fishing. He needed scrap steel, he needed a heavy-duty winch, and most importantly, he hoped the Cormorant contained a compatible engine block he could strip for parts. The bidding had been non-existent. When the auctioneer called for the opening price, the silence was heavy, broken only by the cry of gulls. Arthur raised his hand almost reluctantly, securing the vessel for a sum that was barely more than the cash he had in his pocket. He had bought a ghost ship, a gamble that would either save his livelihood or sink him into bankruptcy. The process of moving the Cormorant to his private slipway was the first indication that something was amiss. Arthur used his small tug capability to guide the old trawler through the choppy harbor waters. As the tow lines pulled taut, the Cormorant felt incredibly heavy, dragging through the water with a sluggish resistance that defied its size. A standard trawler of this class should have bobbed relatively easily, especially since it was supposedly stripped of fuel and cargo years ago. The displacement suggested there was something dense weighing down the keel, perhaps concrete ballast added by a previous owner to stabilize the aging hull, or perhaps the hull plating was thicker than standard commercial grade. Arthur focused on the navigation, sweating despite the cold, maneuvering the hulking mass into the cradle of his dry dock. As the water drained away and the ship settled onto the blocks, the sheer mass of the vessel caused the timber supports to groan under the strain. It was an ominous start to a salvage operation that needed to go perfectly. Once the vessel was secured, Arthur grabbed his toolkit, a heavy pry bar, and his high-intensity work lantern. He boarded the Cormorant via a rusty ladder, his boots echoing on the steel deck. The silence on board was absolute. The ship smelled of wet rot, old diesel, and the metallic tang of decay. He bypassed the wheelhouse, which was littered with bird droppings and shattered glass, and headed straight for the main deck hatch that led to the engine room. This was the heart of the salvage. If the engine was seized or cracked, the entire purchase was a waste. The hatch wheel was fused with rust, requiring Arthur to use a sledgehammer to loosen the locking mechanism. With a grinding screech of metal on metal, the wheel turned, and he heaved the heavy steel door open. A blast of stale, oily air rushed up from the dark abyss below, carrying a scent that was surprisingly distinct. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled like heavy machine grease and preservation oil. Hey everyone! We are taking a quick second here because we have a massive goal to hit. We are incredibly close to reaching 10,000 subscribers on this channel, and we need your help to cross that finish line. If you enjoy these stories of discovery and maritime mystery, please smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. It helps us keep finding these incredible stories for you. Also, we want to know our community better. Drop a comment below telling us which country you are watching from. We read every single comment. And if you really want to support the channel's research, check out the Super Thanks button below the video. Now, let's get back into the engine room of the Cormorant. Arthur descended the steep iron stairs into the gloom, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the suspended dust particles. The engine room was cavernous, larger than he had expected for a 60-foot trawler. As his boots hit the diamond plate flooring, he swept the light around. The space was cluttered with pipes and valves, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the room. Dominating the space was the engine. It was massive, far larger than the standard 300-horsepower diesels usually fitted in boats of this era. It was a looming block of iron, coated in a thick, haphazard layer of industrial gray paint that looked like it had been applied with a mop. It was the size of a locomotive engine, taking up nearly 70% of the walkable floor space. Arthur felt a knot of worry in his stomach, This beast was too big to fit into the Sarah Jane. His plan to swap the engines was instantly dead. He would have to strip it for copper and high-grade steel instead. He approached the massive block, running his gloved hand along the valve covers. The paint was thick and rubbery, peeling in places. It wasn't the original finish. It was a clumsy attempt to cover the metal, likely done decades ago to prevent rust during layup. Arthur pulled out a heavy-duty scraper from his belt. He needed to identify the manufacturer to see if the internal components had any resale value. He chose a flat section on the side of the block, near where the injection pump should be, and dug the scraper into the gray coating. The paint came away in long, satisfying strips, revealing the metal underneath. Arthur stopped. He expected to see pitted cast iron, dark and porous. Instead, the beam of his light reflected off a surface that was smooth, machined, and strangely bright. It looked like high-grade aluminum alloy or perhaps a specialized naval steel. He scraped harder, widening the window. The metal beneath the ugly paint was pristine, protected perfectly by the oil and the thick outer coating. Arthur frowned, leaning in closer. This level of machining was not found on commercial trawler engines. This was precision engineering. He moved his light to the cylinder heads. There were 12 individual heads, meaning this was a V12 configuration, a monstrous amount of power for a fishing boat. He found a small, rectangular plate riveted to the side of the block, also painted over. With delicate care, he used the corner of his scraper to chip away the paint from the tag. He brushed away the flakes with his thumb and brought the light within inches of the metal. The text stamped into the brass was not English. It was German. The eagle insignia of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy from the Second World War, was faintly visible, flanked by a serial number and a production date, 1944. Arthur stepped back, his breath misting in the cold air. This wasn't a trawler engine. This was a piece of military hardware. The implications began to race through his mind. Why would a post-war British trawler be fitted with a high-performance Nazi naval engine? He circled the machine, looking for more clues. He noticed that the engine mounts were not standard. They were reinforced with heavy steel girders welded directly to the keel, suggesting the boat had been built specifically to hold this engine, rather than the engine being retrofitted. He traced the exhaust manifolds. They were water-cooled and intricately designed to muffle sound, a feature used in stealth vessels, not fishing boats that chugged loudly into port. Arthur realized he wasn't looking at scrap metal. He was looking at a prototype. The sheer size suggested it produced over 1,000 horsepower, enough to make the Cormorant one of the fastest vessels in its class during its prime. He had bought the boat for the price of steel, but the engine block alone, if it was indeed a rare survivor from 1944, could be worth more than his entire fishing fleet. But there was something else. As Arthur moved to the rear of the engine to inspect the transmission coupling, he stepped on a loose floor plate. It clattered loudly, tilting to reveal a dark space beneath the bilge. He knelt, shining his light into the gap. The bilge was usually a dirty space filled with oil and water, but this space was dry. And sitting there, wedged between the ribs of the hull and the engine mount, was a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle. It wasn't debris. It was placed there intentionally, hidden under the false floor of the engine room. Arthur reached down, his fingers brushing against the rough, oil-soaked canvas. It was heavy, dense, and unyielding. The mystery of the Cormorant was not just about the engine. The ship had been used to transport something, and whatever it was, it had been left behind when the engine was painted over and the ship abandoned. Arthur pulled the bundle up onto the deck, the weight of it straining his forearms. He sat on the cold floor, the massive German engine looming over him, and pulled out his knife to cut the rotting twine that held the canvas together. Arthur's knife sliced through the oil-soaked canvas with a gritty rasp, the sound sharp in the dampened acoustics of the engine room. He peeled back the heavy, stiff layers of fabric, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that matched the storm beginning to howl outside the dry dock. Inside the bundle, wrapped in an additional layer of wax paper, was a thick, leather-bound folder and a rectangular metal box. The smell that wafted up was distinct, not the rot of the sea, but the aroma of old library archives, of curing leather and decaying paper preserved in a vacuum of grease. He opened the metal box first. It contained a set of precision tools, their steel bodies gleaming under his flashlight. They were spanners and calipers, stamped with the same eagle insignia he had found on the engine block. These were the original maintenance tools, custom-forged for this specific machine, left with it as if the mechanic had just stepped out for a smoke break 70 years ago and never returned. He set the tools aside, treating them like religious artifacts, and picked up the leather folder. It was heavy, the binding cracked but intact. He opened it on his lap, the yellowed pages stiff and brittle. The first document was a technical schematic, an intricate blueprint drawn in blue ink on vellum. It depicted the V12 engine in front of him, but the drawing revealed details the layers of paint had hidden. The title block in the corner read Daimler-Benz MB518, Prototype, Knackjagger. Arthur's German was non-existent, but the diagrams spoke the universal language of engineering. The schematic showed a massive supercharger system mounted to the front of the block, a component that was currently missing from the engine in the room. According to the drawing, this wasn't just a propulsion unit. It was a high-performance beast designed for explosive speed, capable of pushing a vessel to over 40 knots, a speed unheard of for a trawler. The schematic was stamped Geheim, secret. Arthur turned the page to a navigation log. The entries were handwritten in sharp, angular cursive. Dates from late 1944 and early 1945 filled the columns. Coordinates, fuel consumption rates, and engine temperature readings were meticulously recorded. He traced the final entries with a grease-stained finger. The coordinates placed the vessel off the coast of Norway, then moving frantically across the North Sea toward Scotland under the cover of darkness. The final entry was not a location, but a single, hurried note in red ink that translated to engine secured. Identity masked. Awaiting retrieval. The date was 2 days after the official surrender of Germany. The Cormorant wasn't a British trawler that had been retrofitted. It was a German vessel, likely a high-speed E-boat or a prototype stealth transport, that had been captured or surrendered, then crudely disguised as a fishing boat to hide its technology or its mission. The trawler superstructure was a shell, a wooden and steel disguise built over a wolf in sheep's clothing. He stood up, the blueprint clutched in his hand, and approached the front of the engine block again. He shone his light on the area where the schematic showed the supercharger should be. There was a large, bolted steel plate covering the mounting points. The supercharger had been removed to lower the engine's profile and power, likely to make it behave like a standard fishing diesel and avoid suspicion. But where was it? Arthur scanned the cramped engine room. If the crew had hidden the tools and the logs, they wouldn't have thrown the most valuable component overboard. They intended to retrieve it. He moved to the forward bulkhead, the wall separating the engine room from the fish hold. The blueprints showed that the engine required massive air intakes, ducting that didn't exist in the current configuration. He tapped the bulkhead with his pry bar. Clang, clang. It sounded solid. He moved 2 feet to the left, behind a stack of rotting nets he had ignored earlier. Thud. The sound was different, duller, deeper. There was a void behind the steel. Arthur grabbed the scraper again and attacked the paint on the bulkhead. As the gray flakes fell away, he found the outline of a welded seam. It was a hasty job, the welding bead rough and uneven compared to the precision of the hull. Someone had sealed off a compartment here, welding a steel plate over a recess in the wall. Arthur didn't hesitate. He climbed out of the engine room, ran to his workshop across the yard, and returned with an angle grinder and a heavy extension cord. The sparks flew in a shower of orange cascades as the grinding disc bit into the old welds. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, a screaming mechanical shriek that vibrated through the hull. It took him an hour of sweating, back-breaking work to cut through 3 sides of the plate. He switched off the grinder, the silence rushing back in, ringing in his ears. He jammed the pry bar into the cut and heaved with all his weight. The metal groaned, then bent outward. He shone the light into the hole. The beam hit chrome and polished aluminum. Sitting on a wooden pallet inside the false bulkhead was the missing supercharger. It was a magnificent piece of machinery, almost as large as a small car engine itself, with complex impeller blades and intake manifolds. But it wasn't alone. Next to the supercharger were 4 metal canisters, sealed with wax and lead wire. They were military-grade transport containers, marked with chemical warnings and weight indicators. The boat wasn't just hiding a prototype engine. It was hiding the fuel or the payload required for its final mission. Arthur realized the scale of what he had found. This wasn't just a museum piece. The technology in this room, the prototype engine, the supercharger, the specific design, represented a missing link in marine engineering that historians had theorized about but never seen. But the canisters worried him. He carefully reached in and touched the nearest one. It was cold, colder than the surrounding air. He inspected the markings. Schwerswasser was stenciled on the side, fading but legible. He didn't know the translation, but the skull and crossbones symbol was universal. He backed away slowly. He needed to know exactly what he was dealing with before he touched anything else. He retreated to the wheelhouse, the only place with a signal, and used his phone to translate the text from the logbook and the canister markings. His fingers trembled as he typed the German words into the search bar. The result for the engine model confirmed his suspicion. Experimental high-speed diesel, production halted 1945, assumed destroyed. The value of the engine alone, to a collector or a museum, was easily in the millions. It was the only surviving example. But when he typed in the text from the canister, the blood drained from his face. The translation read, "Heavy water, industrial grade." Arthur sat in the captain's chair, staring out at the rain-lashed shipyard. Heavy water was used in nuclear research. The Cormorant had been part of a desperate, final attempt to smuggle nuclear components or research materials out of Europe before the collapse of the Reich. The boat had made it to the UK, but for some reason the crew had abandoned the mission, hidden the evidence, and melted into the population, leaving the deadly cargo and the priceless engine rotting inside a fake fishing trawler for 70 years. Arthur wasn't just a fisherman with a scrapboat anymore. He was the owner of a hazardous, classified, and incredibly valuable maritime crime scene. He knew he couldn't call the police. They would seize the boat, quarantine his shipyard, and he would lose everything. He would be left with nothing but a story. He needed to be smart. He needed to secure the asset, verify if the heavy water was actually radioactive or just a precursor, and find a private buyer who understood discretion. But first, he had to see if the engine still ran. If he could reunite the supercharger with the block and fire it up, he would prove the find was authentic. It was a dangerous, insane idea, but Arthur was a man who had bet his last dollar on a rust bucket. He went back down into the hole. He was going to rebuild the Nazi monster. He spent the next 3 nights in a fever state, sleeping on a cot in the workshop, eating cold beans, and working endlessly on the engine. He used the schematic to understand the connections. He carefully unbolted the blanking plates. He used a chain hoist to drag the massive supercharger out of its hiding spot and suspend it over the engine. The precision of the German engineering was miraculous. Despite 70 years of dormancy, the bolts turned, the surfaces mated perfectly, and the supercharger dropped into place with a solid metallic clunk that felt like a vault door closing. He tightened the fittings, his hands covered in grease, his mind focused entirely on the mechanics. He checked the oil reservoirs. The oil was old, thick like syrup, but not contaminated with water. The seals had held. He drained the system and hand-pumped 50 gallons of fresh synthetic oil into the beast. He hooked up a bank of heavy-duty marine batteries to the starter motor. He didn't dare use the old fuel tanks. Instead, he rigged a jerry can of fresh diesel directly to the injection pump. This was the moment of truth. If the engine was seized internally, the starter would just click and burn out. If it turned over, he had a living dinosaur. He put on ear defenders, checked the ventilation, and pressed the heavy brass starter button he had rewired. The sound was not a click. It was a slow, rhythmic whoosh 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 as the massive pistons, the size of paint buckets, began to move. The starter whined, struggling against the immense compression. Arthur held his breath, his finger jamming the button down. Whoosh whoosh chuff. A puff of black smoke shot out of the disconnected exhaust manifold. Chuff. Bang. The engine kicked. Arthur pulled the throttle lever slightly. With a thunderous roar that shook dust from the ceiling rafters, the V-12 caught fire. It didn't chug like a trawler, it snarled. The sound was a deep, guttural mechanical scream, smooth and terrifyingly loud. The supercharger whined, a high-pitched turbine sound overlaying the bass of the combustion. The Cormorant vibrated on its blocks, the sheer torque of the engine threatening to shake the vessel apart on dry land. Arthur watched the gauges he had hooked up. Oil pressure, rising. Temperature, stable. He killed the engine after 30 seconds, the silence returning instantly, leaving his ears ringing. He leaned against the vibrating metal, laughing hysterically. It worked. He had a functioning, prototype super-engine. But the vibration had dislodged something else. In the false compartment where the supercharger had been, the vibration had caused the stack of heavy water canisters to shift, revealing a small, flat wooden case underneath them that had been completely hidden before. Arthur reached in and pulled out the flat case. It wasn't military. It was polished mahogany, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It looked like a jewelry box. He unlatched it. Inside, resting on blue velvet, were not jewels, but a series of glass plates and a small, leather-bound notebook with the initials WH embossed in gold. He picked up one of the glass plates and held it up to the worklight. It was a photographic negative. The image was inverted, but clear. It showed this boat, the Cormorant, docked in a submarine pen, surrounded by high-ranking officers in long coats. But in the background of the photo, being loaded onto the boat, were not canisters of water, but crates. Crates marked with the symbol of the Reichsbank. Arthur opened the small notebook. It wasn't a logbook. It was a personal diary of the lead engineer. The last entry, written in English, a sign of preparation for surrender, read, "The water is a decoy. The engine is the distraction. The true payload is in the keel. God forgive us." Arthur dropped the notebook. He looked at the floor of the engine room. The keel. The very bottom of the ship. The heavy water was just a scare tactic to keep people away, and the engine was a marvel to distract engineers. The real reason this boat was built, the real reason it was so heavy on the tow line, was buried in the concrete ballast in the keel. He grabbed the sledgehammer. He wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was a treasure hunter. Arthur stood alone in the silence of the dry dock, the sledgehammer heavy in his grip, looking down at the bilge of the Cormorant. The diary lay on the workbench, its final warning about the true payload in the keel burning in his mind. The keel of a trawler was the structural spine, the lowest point of the vessel, usually filled with concrete or scrap metal to act as ballast and keep the ship stable in rough seas. If the German crew had hidden something there, they had poured tons of concrete over it, sealing it in a tomb of artificial stone. Arthur knew a sledgehammer wouldn't be enough. The concrete used in maritime ballast was often reinforced and exceptionally dense. He needed pneumatic power. He locked the engine room hatch, secured the yard gates with a heavy chain, and went to his equipment shed to retrieve his jackhammer, a heavy-duty industrial breaker he used for busting up old slipways. Dragging the compressor and the heavy breaker hose down into the engine room was a nightmare. The space was already cramped with the massive V-12 engine and the displaced heavy water canisters. Arthur had to snake the air hose through the skylight, the yellow tube looking like an four-line feeding the heart of the ship. He positioned himself in the narrow walkway between the engine block and the hull wall, directly over the section where the diary indicated the ballast was deepest. He put on his safety goggles and ear defenders, took a deep breath of the oily air, and pulled the trigger. The jackhammer roared to life, the chisel bit slamming into the concrete floor with a violence that shook his teeth. Dust exploded into the air, instantly coating the pristine engine he had just cleaned. The noise was deafening, amplified by the steel hull, turning the engine room into a ringing bell. For 2 hours, Arthur fought the floor. The concrete was incredibly high quality, far superior to standard construction mix. It was laced with steel aggregate, making it resistant to cracking. His arms ached, his sweat soaking through his coveralls, turning the dust on his skin into gray mud. He was chipping away inches at a time, creating a crater in the center of the bilge. He had to be careful. If he went too deep and punched through the outer hull, he would compromise the boat's integrity. He was looking for a void, a box, anything that wasn't stone. Just as his fatigue was about to force a break, the tone of the jackhammer changed. The chisel slipped through the concrete and hit something that didn't crumble. It yielded with a dull, metallic thud. Arthur stopped the hammer, the silence rushing back in, ringing with a high-pitched whine in his ears. He fell to his knees, brushing away the pulverized concrete and dust with his gloved hands. Buried about 18 inches deep in the ballast was a flat, dark surface. It wasn't the rusted steel of the hull. It was lead. He used a hand chisel and a hammer to carefully widen the hole, exposing a rectangular object roughly the size of a briefcase, but significantly thicker. It was a lead coffin, a sealed box designed to protect its contents from radiation, moisture, and time. And it wasn't alone. As he cleared more debris, he saw the edge of another one next to it, and another. The entire keel was lined with them, arranged like bricks in a wall, buried under the concrete floor. His heart hammered against his ribs. Lead lining suggested volatile materials, perhaps more of the heavy water or something worse. But the diary had said payload, not weapon. And the photograph had shown Reichsbank crates. Banks didn't store toxic waste, they stored value. Arthur wedged his crowbar under the lip of the first lead case. The metal was soft, deforming under the pressure, but the seal was made of pitch and wax, holding fast. He groaned with exertion, putting his entire body weight into the lever. With a sucking sound of braking vacuum, the lid peeled back. Arthur didn't see a glow. He saw darkness. He shone his flashlight into the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that was surprisingly still damp, were rows of rectangular bars. They weren't shiny. They were dull, coated in a layer of protective grease. Arthur reached in and pulled one out. It was heavy, shockingly heavy. A small bar, no bigger than a smartphone, weighed nearly a kilogram. He wiped the grease on his sleeve. The dull surface gave way to a deep, lustrous yellow warmth that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam rather than reflect it. Gold. Pure, solid gold. He brought the bar closer to his face. Stamped into the soft metal was a circular hallmark, the Swiss foundry mark, and below it, a 1943 date and the Reichsbank eagle. This was looted gold. It was part of the reserves that had vanished from Europe in the final chaotic months of the war. Arthur looked back at the hole in the floor. There were at least 20 boxes visible in the section he had cleared. If each box held 20 bars, he did a quick mental calculation. The value was astronomical. He wasn't looking at a retirement fund. He was looking at the GDP of a small nation. The ballast that made the Cormorant so heavy wasn't concrete. It was gold bullion disguised as a ship's keel. He sat back on his heels, the gold bar heavy in his lap, a wave of nausea washing over him. This was too much. This wasn't salvage. This was international history. If he reported this, the government would seize it instantly. The boat would be swarmed by agents, historians, and lawyers. He would get a finder's fee if he was lucky, or be arrested for possession of stolen property if he wasn't. But if he kept it? How do you sell Nazi gold? You can't just walk into a pawn shop. He was a fisherman, not a fence for international criminal syndicates. He placed the bar back into the lead box and folded the lid down, covering the treasure. He needed to think. He stood up to stretch his cramping legs, his eyes scanning the engine room with a new perspective. The heavy water canisters, the massive prototype engine, the gold, it was a cohesive escape package. The engine provided the speed to outrun patrols, the heavy water provided the cover story, making the boat appear to be a hazardous transport to be avoided, and the gold was the funding for life after the war. But why did they stop? Why was the boat abandoned in a British scrapyard instead of making it to South America or wherever they were going? Arthur walked over to the stack of heavy water canisters he had moved earlier to make room for the jackhammer. He wanted to double-check them. If the gold was real, and the engine was real, maybe the heavy water was real too, and not a decoy as the diary claimed. He shined his light on the canisters. When he had moved them, he had been rough, sliding them across the steel deck. He noticed something now that made his blood run cold. One of the canisters had a hairline crack along the bottom seam, likely caused by the vibration of the jackhammer or the rough handling. It wasn't leaking water. A fine, gray powder was sifting out of the crack, forming a small pile on the deck plates. Arthur leaned in, careful not to breathe it in. It wasn't liquid. The diary said, "The water is a decoy." That meant the canisters didn't contain water. He touched the powder with the tip of his gloved finger. It was gritty. He looked at the label again. Schwerswasser, heavy water, was painted in large white letters. But underneath, etched into the metal and painted over, was a different code, Z4. Arthur didn't know what Z4 was, but he knew that powder coming out of a sealed military canister from 1945 was never a good sign. He suddenly remembered the scuttling charge, mentioned in passing in similar war stories. Ships rigged to destroy themselves to prevent capture. He looked back at the hole he had dug in the concrete. The lead boxes were tightly packed. He shone his light into the gap between the gold box and the concrete wall. There, nestled deep in the cement, was a glass tube filled with a yellow liquid, connected to a tension wire that ran through the concrete. It was a tilt fuse, a primitive but effective anti-tamper device. The tension wire was embedded in the concrete matrix. When Arthur had used the jackhammer, the vibration had shattered the concrete around it, but miraculously, the glass vial was still intact. However, the wire was now loose, dangling. If he had hammered 2 inches to the left, he would have shattered the vial. The acid inside would have eaten through a retaining pin, striking a primer, and detonating the explosives that were undoubtedly buried beneath the gold. The ship was rigged to blow the moment anyone tried to extract the payload. He was standing on a floating bomb. The gray powder leaking from the canister wasn't the threat. It was the stabilizer for the explosives, or perhaps a chemical agent meant to mix with the blast. The gold was the bait, and the keel was the trap. Arthur froze. The vibration of the jackhammer might have already started a slow chemical reaction he couldn't see. He grabbed the gold bar he had taken out, threw it back in the box, and scrambled out of the engine room, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He needed to get off the Cormorant. He sprinted across the deck and jumped onto the hard concrete of the shipyard, putting distance between himself and the vessel. He stood by the gate, staring at the rusty trawler. It looked so innocent, just a piece of junk. But it was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. He had to make a choice. He could walk away, call the bomb squad, and lose everything. Or he could figure out how to disarm a 70-year-old Nazi booby trap and claim the fortune. As he stood there, weighing his life against the gold, headlights swept across the shipyard gate. A black sedan slowed down, stopped, and then reversed, parking just out of sight of the entrance. It wasn't a local car. It was polished, expensive, and out of place in the grimy industrial district. Arthur crouched behind a pile of lobster pots. He wasn't the only one interested in the Cormorant. The auction hadn't been as unnoticed as he thought. Someone had been tracking this boat, waiting for someone foolish enough to buy it and do the hard work of opening it up. Arthur realized he had just done exactly what they wanted. He had cracked the seal. Now they were here to collect. Arthur crouched low behind a stack of rusted lobster pots, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, watching the scene unfold with a terrifying clarity. The black sedan sat idling just beyond the chain-link fence, its headlights cut, leaving only the dim amber glow of the shipyard security perimeter to illuminate the intruders. Two figures emerged from the vehicle. They moved with a synchronized fluidity that screamed military training, far removed from the clumsy gait of scrap thieves or local vandals. They wore dark, nondescript tactical clothing and carried heavy, waterproof equipment cases. One of them approached the gate lock, produced a pair of hydraulic bolt cutters, and sheared through the hardened steel chain as if it were licorice. They didn't even pause to check for cameras. They knew exactly where they were going. They headed straight for the slipway, their boots making no sound on the wet concrete, their focus locked entirely on the Cormorant. Arthur realized with a sinking dread that he was completely outmatched. He was a fisherman armed with a pocket-knife and a pry bar. These men were professionals sent to recover a lost asset. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows of the winch shed, his breath held tight in his chest. He watched as they boarded the vessel, bypassing the wheelhouse and heading directly for the open engine room hatch. They didn't need to search the ship, they knew the layout. This confirmed Arthur's suspicion that the Cormorant wasn't just a random discovery. It was a known loose end that someone had been monitoring, waiting for the moment it was pulled from the water and accessed. The moment Arthur had registered the ship in his name and dragged it onto the dry dock, he had set off a silent alarm somewhere in a dark corner of the world. The two men disappeared into the gaping maw of the engine room. Arthur waited a heartbeat, then moved. He didn't run away. The instinct to protect his discovery, to protect the fortune that could save his family, overrode his fear. He sprinted in a crouch across the wet yard, using the noise of the wind and rain to mask his approach. He reached the side of the hull and climbed the stern ladder, moving as ghost-like as the ship itself. He crept along the deck, inching toward the open hatch. The yellow glow of their high-powered tactical lights spilled out from below, casting dancing shadows on the derrick. He could hear the low murmur of their voices, urgent and precise, though the words were lost in the echoing steel chamber. He peered over the rim of the hatch, careful to keep his silhouette low. Below, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The men had seen the jackhammer, the hole in the concrete, and the exposed lead box. One of the men was kneeling by the hole, scanning the interior with a device that looked like a Geiger counter or a chemical sniffer. Suddenly, the man froze. He signaled frantically to his partner, pointing at the glass vial embedded in the concrete, the tilt fuse Arthur had narrowly avoided shattering. The partner recoiled, backing away slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of extreme caution. They had recognized the trap. They knew exactly what the Z4 powder and the yellow liquid meant. The dynamic in the engine room shifted instantly from extraction to survival. They were terrified. Arthur saw his opportunity. The heavy steel hatch cover was propped open by a rusted locking pin. If he removed the pin, the cover would slam shut, sealing the engine room. It was a massive slab of steel, airtight and soundproof. He would have the upper hand. But he also remembered the vibration. If the impact of the door detonated the fuse, they would all die. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the pin. Then he saw the man below reach into his pack and pull out a canister of aerosol foam, an expanding, hardening agent likely used to stabilize explosives. They weren't retreating. They were neutralizing the trap so they could steal the gold. They were going to disarm his fortune and walk away with it. Arthur pulled the pin. He didn't let the hatch slam freely. He guided it down with all his strength, fighting the rusty hinges to minimize the impact. It closed with a heavy, dull thud rather than a deafening clang, but the sound was final. He spun the external locking wheel, the threads biting into the groove, sealing the men inside the watertight compartment. He heard muffled shouting from below, a panicked muted vibration against the steel deck, but he ignored it. He was now the captain of the ship, and he had captured the pirates. However, the victory was short-lived. Arthur noticed a faint hissing sound coming from the ventilation pipe that protruded from the deck nearby, the snorkel for the engine room. He put his ear to the pipe. It wasn't just shouting he heard, it was a rhythmic, mechanical clicking sound. Click, click, click. It was coming from the hole in the concrete. The vibration of the door closing, however gentle, had been enough. The tilt fuse hadn't detonated immediately, but it had triggered a secondary timer. The acid vial had likely cracked, beginning the slow corrosion of the firing pin wire. Arthur realized he had locked 2 men in a room with a ticking bomb, and the explosion would vaporize the gold, the engine, the ship, and him. He needed to talk to them. He remembered the old brass voice pipe next to the hatch, a primitive intercom system used before radios. He uncapped it and shouted down. The response was immediate and desperate. The voice on the other end, accented and precise, didn't threaten him. It informed him with chilling calm that the mechanism was a dual-stage glass break timer. The vibration had cracked the ampoule. The acid was eating the wire. They estimated they had less than 12 minutes before the firing pin released and ignited the Z4 powder, which would act as a catalyst for the main charge in the keel. The intruder offered a deal. They had a specialized chemical neutralizer in their car, a binary compound designed specifically to freeze the acid reaction and stabilize the Z4 powder. They had brought it because they knew the ship was rigged. If Arthur let them out, they would die before they could get to the car. If Arthur ran to the car, he wouldn't know which case to open or how to mix the compound. They were at a stalemate. Arthur had to open the hatch, let one of them out to get the kit, while the other stayed as a hostage next to the bomb. It was a test of trust with zero margin for error. Arthur made his choice. He spun the wheel, unlocking the hatch. He lifted it, the heavy steel groaning. The 2 men stood at the bottom of the ladder, their faces pale in the harsh work light. They didn't attack. The fear of the bomb had stripped away their aggression. Arthur gestured for the one with the keys to climb up. The man scrambled up the ladder, sprinting past Arthur without a glance, racing toward the black sedan. Arthur stood at the top of the hatch, looking down at the second man, who was kneeling by the hole in the concrete, staring at the glass vial with a magnifying loupe, counting down the seconds in a whisper. The wire inside the vial was thinning, turning black as the acid ate through it. The man in the car returned, breathless, carrying a silver impact-resistant case. He slid down the ladder, almost falling in his haste. Arthur followed him down, sealing his own fate with them. Inside the engine room, the air was thick with tension and the smell of old oil. The specialist opened the case, revealing 2 syringes and a mixing chamber. His hands shook slightly, but his movements were practiced. He drew liquid from both vials, injected them into the mixer, and shook it violently. The liquid turned a bright neon blue. He attached a long, needle-like applicator. He approached the hole in the concrete. The wire holding the firing pin was now a mere thread. One strong vibration, one cough, and it would snap. The specialist inserted the needle into the crack of the concrete, aiming for the base of the vial. He depressed the plunger. The blue foam expanded instantly, engulfing the vial and the wire, hardening in seconds into a rigid, icy block. The chemical reaction froze the acid and cemented the firing pin in place. The clicking stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the engine had been. The 3 men slumped against the bulkheads, breathing heavily. The immediate threat of death was gone, replaced by the return of the tactical reality. Arthur was standing in a locked room with 2 highly trained operatives who wanted his gold. He gripped his pry bar, his knuckles white. The leader of the 2 men, the one who had neutralized the bomb, slowly packed his kit away. He looked up at Arthur, his expression unreadable. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a satellite phone. He dialed a number, waited, and then spoke a single phrase, "Asset secured. The civilian is viable. Initiate Phase 2. He handed the phone to Arthur. "Someone wants to speak to you," the man said. "You have passed the test. You didn't run. You are now part of the recovery." Arthur took the phone. The voice on the other end was distorted, but authoritative. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a criminal gang. It was a voice that sounded like it came from a boardroom in a government building. The voice explained that the gold wasn't just loot, it was a contingency fund from 1945 that had been erased from history, and the engine was the key to a technology that was still classified. Arthur hadn't just found treasure, he had activated a sleeper project. He was given a choice: walk away with a standard silence fee and forget everything, or partner with them to extract the keel, becoming the legal face of a recovery operation that would rewrite naval history. Arthur looked at the gold bars, the massive German engine, and the two men watching him. If he walked away, he was just a fisherman again. If he stayed, he was entering a world he didn't understand. But looking at the MB-518 engine, he realized he didn't want to leave it. He wanted to see it run at full power. He wanted to know what the Cormorant could really do. He put the phone to his ear. "I'm listening," he said. The voice gave him a set of coordinates. They weren't for a bank. They were for a remote naval testing range in the Scottish Highlands. The Cormorant had to move. It had to go back into the water. The extraction couldn't happen here. It was too exposed. They had to take the ship, the gold, and the bomb up the coast to a secure facility. Arthur was to captain the vessel on its final voyage. The two operatives would act as his crew. They had to launch immediately, before the local authorities or rival factions realized what had happened at the shipyard. Arthur was about to take a Nazi ghost ship, laden with gold and explosives, into the treacherous North Sea at night. The Cormorant slipped out of the harbor mouth like a shadow, the thrum of the massive V-12 engine vibrating through the deck plates, a low-frequency growl that hinted at the power being held in reserve. Arthur stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wooden wheel, staring into the pitch-black expanse of the North Sea. The storm had intensified, whipping the waves into white-capped peaks that smashed against the bow, but the heavy displacement of the gold-laden keel and the sheer torque of the German engine drove the vessel through the swell with terrifying authority. Down in the engine room, the two operatives were monitoring the chemical foam block encasing the tilt fuse. The stabilizer was holding, but the rough seas were testing its integrity. Every slam of the hull against a wave was a roll of the dice. They were 10 miles offshore when the radar screen in the wheelhouse blipped. A single, fast-moving contact was closing in from the east, intercepting their course. It wasn't the Coast Guard. They were broadcasting no identification signal. It was the rival faction the operatives had warned about, the people who had been watching the shipyard, the ones who didn't care about the history or the bomb, only the bullion. Arthur grabbed the voice pipe. "Contact astern. Closing fast. We need more power." The operative's voice crackled back, calm but urgent. "Engage the supercharger. Full throttle. The engine was built for this. Don't worry about the fuse. Speed is safer than a firefight." Arthur took a deep breath. He looked at the throttle lever, which had never been pushed past the first quarter in decades. He reached for the secondary lever, a red-handled control that engaged the mechanical supercharger clutch. He slammed it forward. The reaction was instantaneous. The low growl of the engine transformed into a high-pitched, screaming whine as the massive blower began forcing compressed air into the 12 cylinders. The Cormorant, a 60-year-old fishing trawler, surged forward as if it had been kicked by a giant. The bow lifted high out of the water, the stern dug in, and the vessel began to plane. The speed was unnatural. Trawlers are designed to plod at 10 knots. The Cormorant was now hitting 30, then 35, tearing through the waves in a spray of white foam. The hull groaned under the stress, the timber and steel protesting against the physics of the maneuver, but the German engineering held. The pursuer, a modern fiberglass interceptor, struggled to match the sheer brute force of the heavy steel hull smashing through the rough water. Arthur watched the radar. The blip was falling behind. The 1944 prototype engine, designed to outrun destroyers, was proving its worth 70 years later. They were flying across the dark ocean, a ghost ship powered by a monster. 2 hours later, they reached the rendezvous coordinates, a secluded bay on the coast of a misty Scottish island, illuminated by the floodlights of a waiting naval support vessel. As Arthur throttled back, the engine settling into a rough, triumphant idle, he saw the silhouette of a heavy-lift crane and a team of bomb disposal experts waiting on the pier. The operatives guided him in. The moment the lines were thrown, the ship was swarmed. Arthur was escorted off the bridge, his legs shaking from the adrenaline and the exhaustion. He watched from the safety of the pier as the experts carefully boarded the ship. The extraction took 2 days. First, the bomb squad used a laser cutter to remove the section of the concrete keel containing the fuse, lifting the frozen block of acid and explosives with surgical precision before detonating it in a controlled explosion in a secure bunker miles away. The boom echoed across the island, a final salute to the lethal trap Captain Thorne had set. Then came the gold. Pallet after pallet of lead-lined boxes were hoisted from the bilge. The tally was staggering. The ballast consisted of over 4 tons of gold bullion, looted from central bank reserves, along with the prototype plans and the rare heavy water canisters. The total historical and material value was calculated in the hundreds of millions. Arthur sat in a debriefing room, facing the government agents. The deal was honored. Because he had legally purchased the vessel, reported the find, albeit under duress, and assisted in the recovery of a classified historical asset, he was granted a substantial salvage award. It wasn't the full value of the gold that belonged to the nations from which it was stolen, but the finder's fee, combined with the payment for the rare prototype engine which the Navy Museum desperately wanted, was enough to change his life forever. The check presented to him was for $8.5 million USD. Arthur didn't just take the money and run. He made a specific request as part of the settlement. He wanted the hull of the Cormorant. The government stripped the gold, the dangerous chemicals, and the classified documents, but they left him the empty shell and, crucially, the replica rights to the engine. Arthur used his fortune to completely restore the trawler, not as a fishing boat, but as a floating museum and a testament to the engineering marvel hidden within it. He replaced the dangerous prototype with a modern, reliable diesel for safety, but he had the original V-12 cosmetically restored and mounted in the center of the hold, visible through a glass deck. 6 months later, Arthur stood on the gleaming deck of the restored Cormorant. The rust was gone, replaced by fresh paint and polished brass. He wasn't a struggling fisherman anymore. He was the custodian of one of the greatest maritime secrets of the 20th century. He looked down into the engine room, where visitors were now staring in awe at the massive machine that had once powered a Nazi escape plan. He smiled, patting the rail. He had gone looking for scrap copper and found a legend. The ocean has secrets, and sometimes, if you're lucky, or unlucky, enough, you reel in a catch that bites back. And that is the incredible, true story of how a scrap auction purchase turned into a multi-million-dollar discovery and a race against time. It just goes to show, you never really know what history is hiding in the rust. If you enjoyed this ride, please don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets us find more crazy stories like this one. If you haven't subscribed yet, click that bell icon so you never miss an upload. We have some insane salvage stories coming up next week that you won't believe. And a huge shout out to everyone who supported us with a super thanks on this video. Your support literally funds these investigations. Thanks for watching, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.